Vampires are our greatest desires and worst fears come to life. They exist in the gray area between humanity and monstrosity. Both the ultimate power fantasy and most never-ending nightmare. Uninhibited, existing through raw sexuality and power, vampires are among the most popular and immortal of all the monsters. Our journey traces the vampire's ancient roots in folklore and myth, and its immortality through literature. We will witness the vampire first take root in our fears and our collective psyche, and will be brought face to face with these monsters among us. Vampires skirt the line between living and dead more than any other denizen of the supernatural. They live at night, possess uncanny animal magnetism, and can even shapeshift. Long canine fangs, used to puncture a victim's skin, drink the blood of the innocent. This modern image of a vampire stems from mythologies the world over. For the ancient Greeks, it is the Lamii, a race of vampire-like women. After Libyan queen Lamia sires children with Zeus, the god of thunder, his jealous wife Hera curses Lamia and destroys the illegitimate offspring. Mentally broken, Lamia retreats to a cave, cursed to forever suck the blood of children. The act transforms her from a woman to a creature with serpent-like body and mismatched feet. She gives rise to the Lamii, vampires, with the ability to shapeshift into beautiful women to first seduce unsuspecting men. Philostratus, in his Life of Apollonius, recalls the story of a young student about to marry a rich woman. Apollonius discovers the truth behind this mysterious bride to her unsuspecting suitor.
This fine bride is one of the vampires, that is to say, of those beings whom the many regard to as Lamii or hobgoblins. These beings fall in love, and they are devoted to the delights of Aphrodite, but especially to the flesh of human beings, and they decoy with such delights those whom they mean to devour in their feasts.
Upon being found out, the woman pretends to weep and admits to being a vampire. Where the Lamii are a mockery of humanity, they were not considered the living dead. That stems from the Greek vrikolakos, revenants of the dead who return to either start new lives or to menace the living. Vrikolakos can be destroyed by an all-consuming fire. Perhaps the most like today's vampire, and a source of terror for expectant parents, are the Kalakansarros. Children born between Christmas and the New Year are cursed to become vampires upon their deaths. First, during the cursed week, and for the rest of their lives, their nails will extend into talons to viciously eviscerate anyone in their way. despite blood ties, suspected Kalakansaros can live their entire lives with others fearing them. But upon death and the transformation into a Kalakansaros, they live in the underworld for all but those fateful days at a year's end. Malaysian folklore features perhaps the most terrifying of all vampires, the Penanggal.
Possibly the freakiest vampire in all of mythology comes from Malaysia. The Penanggal actually attacks pregnant women and newborn babies. What's so incredibly unique and scary about the Penanggal is that it actually detaches its head from its body. The head itself flies through the air, its entrails, such as the lungs and the heart following, and attacks either pregnant women or newborn infants. It spits venom. It's very fierce. The only way to defeat a Penanggal is actually to pour broken glass down the neck cavity of its body during nighttime while the head's separated from it, so that when the head does go to rejoin the body, it can't because of all of the broken glass. And since it's sunrise, it'll completely dissipate.
Over in China, there is the Jiangxi. Jiangxi are also known as hopping vampires, unable to walk from the rigor mortis in their dead joints. Instead, they hop from place to place, arms held out at length, hoping to catch their prey in a grotesque parody of life. Like contemporary vampires, the Jiangxi only walk at night. If one is allowed to exist long enough, it transforms into a long, white-haired creature with the ability to fly. At this point, they are practically unstoppable. But certain things, a bullet, fire, or thunder, can bring an end to their undead existence. Qing Dynasty writer Pu Songling, born in 1640, pens a tale of a Jiangxi, the resuscitated corpse. An old man and his son live in a roadside inn miles from the city. Dusk approaches as four strangers arrive for lodging, only to find all of the beds occupied. If they aren't too particular, the old man tells them, they can stay in the women's quarters. There is, however, one tenant already sleeping there. The old man's newly dead daughter-in-law, her body in repose until her coffin can be bought. The exhausted travelers throw themselves on the beds and are soon snoring loudly, with the exception of one. He hears a creaking of the trestles on which the dead body is laid out. The dead girl arises, the shroud falling from her body as she stands. When she reaches the beds, she blows on the other three travelers. The fourth, in a great fight, stealthily draws up the bedclothes over his face and holds his breath. She breathes on his cover, but as he has no breath to steal, she turns back to her resting place. The man scrambles to get dressed, and then he hears a creak and scrambles back under the sheet. She's again coming for him and breathes on his sheet while he once more holds his breath. After she goes back into repose, the man grabs his pants, pulls the door bolt, and runs for his life. He shrieks at the top of his lungs as the woman follows close behind him. Still, no one hears him, so he runs toward the city and stops at a monastery. A monk, thinking the man is a lunatic, refuses to let him in, not knowing the fate he has left him to. The man, with the dead girl catching up, hides behind a tree and dodges her hands. She finally makes a mad rush at the tree, and the man jumps back. The next morning, the monk steps out of the monastery and finds the man lying on the ground, senseless. The body of a dead girl is stuck to the tree. Her fingers are dug into the trunk, the bark past her fingernails. Over in England, in the 12th century, the monk William of Newburgh chronicles both history and myth in his epic 5-volume Historia Rerum Anglicarum. Amongst these are early chronicles of sanguisuga, the Latin term for bloodsucker. William reports of a vampire at Melrose Abbey, the undead specter of a chaplain interested in pursuits of the flesh in both life and death.
Whereupon he wandered beyond the walls and hovered chiefly with loud groans and horrible murmurs round the bedchamber of his former mistress. She, after this had frequently occurred, became exceedingly terrified, revealed her fears of danger to one of the friars who visited her on the business of the monastery, demanding with tears that prayer more earnest than usual should be poured out to the Lord in her behalf, as for one in agony. With whose anxiety the friar, for she appeared deserving of the best endeavors on the part of the holy convent of that place by her frequent donations to it, piously and justly sympathized, and promised a speedy remedy through the mercy of the Most High Provider of all.
The friar is accompanied by 3 brothers, and they await the return of the priest. Midnight passes. After they have stood vigil for several hours, 3 of the party decide to go inside for warmth, leaving the original friar alone.
He withstood the onset of the fiend, who came rushing upon him with terrible noise, and he struck the axe which he wielded in his hand deep into its body. On receiving this wound, the monster groaned aloud, and turning its back, fled with a rapidity not at all inferior to that which he had advanced, while the man urged his foe from behind, and compelled him to seek his own tomb again, which opened of its own accord, and receiving its guest from the advance of the pursuer, immediately appeared to close with the same facility.
The 4 men, upon dawn, dig up the priest's body. In the corpse, still gushing blood, is the axe wound. Taking the body away from sacred ground, they burn the vampire priest and scatter his ashes to the winds. The vampire myth hews closest to what we know today in the 16th century Slavic regions of Eastern Europe. In 1526, Turkey conquers Hungary in battle, breaking Hungary between the Turks, Austrian Habsburgs, and the independent state of Transylvania. These countries are neighbored with Slavic ones who develop their own vampire mythology, much of which stems in the Balkans from the 9th century disagreements between paganism and Christianity. As Christianity dominates the region, superstitions and pagan beliefs survive, primarily in the belief in vampirism. The first instance of the word upir, soon to become vampire, appears in 1047 in a Russian document that calls a prince a wicked vampire, or upir lishi. Other terms synonymous with vampire erupt around this time. The Serbo-Croatian uparina, the Ukrainian upirbi, and the Bulgarian vampir. These vampires are initially created through a curse placed on those excommunicated by the church, a violent death or suicide, an improper burial, or even the death of an infant before it can be baptized into the church. When a vampire scourge is suspected, villagers exhume the body of the recently dead, usually one who had died within 40 days, as in the period between the death and return of Christ, and investigate it for signs of vampirism. Are the joints pliable? Are there traces of blood around the mouth? What of a bloating or long fingernails? When found, drastic measures are taken to keep the vampire from rising again. A wooden or metal stake is forcibly driven through the heart, head, or stomach. The head is cut off and placed between the feet for reburial. Forever purified real-life vampires, Elizabeth Bathory, also known as the Blood Countess. Born in 1560, Elizabeth is raised in Exit, Transylvania, when the Ottoman Empire clashes with Austrian armies and Protestantism emerges to challenge Roman Catholicism. After she secretly gives birth to a child conceived with a peasant, Bathory marries Count Ferenc Nadasdy. He is a soldier who leaves her alone and in charge of their home, Castle Sarvar. Bathory is cruel to her servants and the nearby peasantry. One girl, caught stealing fruit, is tied naked to a tree and smeared with honey. Others get strips of oil paper lit between their toes, and she even sticks pins underneath the fingernails of others. The most unlucky are thrown, naked and wet, into the cold winter night to freeze to death. The equally cruel Count Nadasdy dies in 1604, leaving Bathory to devise new methods of abuse on her own. Living between Vienna and two homes in Slovakia, Bathory starts experimenting with sorcery in the hope of retaining her beauty that threatens to fade with old age.
After Elizabeth Bathory's husband, Count Nadasdy, died in 1604, she started dabbling in sorcery. She was interested in the rejuvenative qualities of virgin blood, interestingly enough. And Elizabeth started collecting virgins and torturing them, bleeding them, and then allegedly bathing in their blood. Allegedly, Bathory's favorite torture was to throw peasant girls in spiked cages. As she shut the doors, the spikes would pierce the girls' bodies, forcing them to bleed out. Bathory would be right beneath the raised cage, the blood dripping down right on her, showering her. Her hope and belief was, of course, that it would rejuvenate her fleeting youth. We don't know if it's true or not, but it does make for a great story.
It all catches up to her by 1610, when, spurred on by word of her atrocities and hoping to confiscate her land, an official inquiry is begun.
Word had gotten out of Elizabeth Bathory's atrocities, and officials who actually happened to be anxious to seize her land started an investigation. Several girls were found held captive within her castle. They found bodies of about 50 who had been killed over the years, with records of 600 more. What's most fascinating about this, like I'd mentioned earlier, is that officials just wanted to take her land. So they took stock in these wild rumors that were flying about the Blood Countess to have an excuse to take her castle.
Further investigation uncovers 50 bodies and documentation of more than 600 victims from over the years.
Elizabeth's cohorts are all found guilty. The one who got off the easiest was merely beheaded. Two of the others had their fingers pulled off by hot pincers and were then burned alive. As for Elizabeth Bathory, she was walled in inside a room of her castle. There was a slit to allow food in. Very little sunlight came in. She lasted 4 years and died in 1614. It's a pathetic, pathetic end to a fierce woman.
One of the most well-known cases of real-life vampires occurs around the same time in Serbia and is documented by historian Montague Summers in the 1920s. An historian of occultism and the supernatural, Summers pens The Vampire, His Kith and Kin in 1928. It is the first serious study of the vampire. It is 1727. Serbian farmer Arnold Paole has fought more than other men during the war. In Greece, Paole is attacked by a vampire. He quickly tracks it down and kills it. To prevent his own vampirism, he eats dirt from its grave and smothers himself in its blood. Shortly after, Paole returns home to Serbia. He falls off a hay wagon and breaks his neck. He dies soon after, but his story does not stop there. A month later, reports of Paole returning to attack people and livestock, surface. Some claim he visits at night, with locked doors and barred windows, proving no obstacle for him. Then, 4 people who are visited by Pole die. 40 days after his death, and under orders by the Austrian Emperor, field medic Johannes Flukinger leads an exhumation of the grave, where they find Paole's body, fresh in appearance and soaked in blood. It is described as such by vampire historian Montague Summers.
It was soon apparent that there lay before them the thing they dreaded, the vampire. He looked indeed as if he had not been dead a day. Accordingly, they scattered garlic over the remains and drove a stake through the body, which, it is said, gave a piercing shriek as the warm blood spouted out in a great crimson jet.
Almost 200 years after Bathory's bloody spree, over in France, lives the Viscount de Moriève. Able to maintain his title and properties throughout the tumultuous French Revolution, Moriève begins his own reign of terror when he kills his own employees. With his own life ended at the hand of an assassin, the townsfolk think they've seen the last of the villain. But they are wrong. Fatally so. Not long after his burial, small children start dying. On their necks are the marks of vampires' fangs. After 72 years and more dead children, Moriève's grandson decides to either put the rumors to rest or bring an end to the curse. Accompanied by the authorities, they dig up the Viscount's body. What they see is beyond any explanation. At least, any natural explanation. His countenance is unblemished, as it was in life. The nails have grown. The skin is soft to the touch, not cold and dead. And there is blood in the heart and chest. The Viscount is staked. A shower of blood spurts out as the corpse groans. Then it is burned. France will have an indirect hand in the creation of a new kind of vampire, not many years after the Viscount's second death. One tense weekend, a poet's challenge will lead to the creation of the first literary vampire, one patterned after the immortal poet himself. By 1816, English poet Lord Byron is outcast from allegations of incest with his half-sister Augusta. The eccentric Byron sleeps in so as to avoid too much exposure from the sun. He is known as the most dangerous man in Europe to many women. His odd, nocturnal activities will, unbeknownst to him, forever impact the vampire in literature. Leaving the country until the scandal subsides, Byron hires 21-year-old John Polidori as his physician. Despite finishing medical school by age 19, the brilliant Polidori holds literary aspirations and admires the older Byron. They leave London at 10 a.m. on the morning of April 2nd, 1816, in a custom-made coach replicated from Napoleon's own extravagant one. It is not long before Polidori wears on the poet, as Byron told his publisher, John Murray, in a letter.
I was never much more disgusted with any human production than with the eternal nonsense and tracasseries and emptiness and ill humor and vanity of that young person.
Nevertheless, Polidori accompanies Byron to the Villa Diodati on Lake Geneva. Amongst those who join them are the poet Percy Bysshe Shelley, his fiancée, Mary Wollstonecraft, and her half-sister, who happens to be Byron's pregnant former mistress. Polidori becomes the butt of Byron's jokes. Realizing the young doctor's infatuation with Mary, Byron urges him to jump down from a small height to run down a hill and help Mary up to the villa. Polidori lands awkwardly and seriously injures his ankle. Byron openly laughs at the injured and embarrassed Polidori, who later gets his revenge by hitting the poet on the knee with an oar while boating. One fateful night later, Byron, in his deep and dramatic voice, reads through a book of German ghost stories, embracing the ambiance of a colossal thunderstorm. It is in the midst of this uncharacteristic and freakish weather that Byron issues a challenge for everyone to concoct their own terrifying story. They begin telling their tales on the night of June 17th. For Byron, it is a story of two men who travel in Greece, where one dies and later reappears in England and has an affair with the other's sister. On June 19th, Polidori weaves his tale, a story about a woman with a skull for a head who was punished for peeping through a keyhole. Mary Shelley, as she will become known after marriage, says this in her diary.
Poor Polidori had some terrible idea about a skull-headed lady who was so punished for peeping through a keyhole. What to see, I forget.
Mary Shelley's idea, spoken aloud as had the others, becomes the main idea for her future novel, The Modern Prometheus, better known as Frankenstein. Byron becomes fed up with Polidori and sends him back to England on September 16th. Amidst the friction created by Polidori is a challenge to duel, as well as a vow to shoot Shelley. Byron's estimation is generous at worst.
His faults are the faults of a pardonable vanity in youth. His remaining with me was out of the question. I have enough to do to manage my own scrapes. And as precepts without example are not the most gracious homilies, I thought it better to give him his conjure. But I know no great harm of him, and some good. He is clever and accomplished, knows his profession by all accounts well, and is honorable in his dealings, and not at all malevolent.
After burning through the severance pay given to him by Byron, Polidori returns to England and writes a story of his own. One fleshed out from his notes of Byron's resort tale. Polidori sells his short story, The Vampire, for £30 in 1819. The preface, likely written by an editor, recounts the night in Lake Geneva and, ironically, credits the vampire to Lord Byron. Polidori is not amused.
Your Genevan correspondent has led you into a mistake with regard to the tale of The Vampire, which is not Lord Byron's, but was written entirely by me at the request of a lady, who, upon my mentioning that his lordship had said that it was his intention of writing a ghost story, depending for interest upon the circumstances of two friends leaving England, and one dying in Greece, the other finding him alive upon his return, and making love to his sister, saying that she thought it impossible to work up such materials, desired I would write it for her, which I did in 2 idle mornings by her side. These circumstances above mentioned, and the one of the dying man having obtained an oath that the survivor should not in any way disclose his disease, are the only parts of the tale belonging to his lordship.
the two men from Byron's spoken tale become the protagonist, Aubrey, and the mysterious Lord Ruthven, the enigmatic and aristocratic vampire who brims with sexuality and magnetism.
His peculiarities caused him to be invited to every house. All wished to see him, and those who had been accustomed to violent excitement and now felt the weight of ennui were pleased at having something in their presence capable of engaging their attention. In spite of the deadly hue of his face, which never gained a warmer tint, either from the blush of modesty or from the strong emotion of passion, though its form and outline were beautiful, many of the female hunters after notoriety attempted to win his attentions and gain at least some marks of what they might term affection.
As the story progresses, Ruthven and Aubrey part ways, leaving Aubrey to study the ancient ruins of Greece. There, he falls in love with a peasant girl who becomes the first victim of the vampire. The vampire not only sets the stage for the literary vampire, an aristocratic immortal who toys with man for his own amusement and nourishment, and is a human transformed rather than merely possessed, but also inspires a vampire craze across Europe. French author Charles Nodier pens a play adaptation, La Vampire, which debuts in 1820 and inspires further vampire plays, casting the villain as a romantic anti-hero, rife with melodrama. Polidori, however, sees none of this, as his publisher registers the copyright before he can. He is able to get them to settle for a payment of £30 or $50. Given the views on sexuality, vampirism, with the biting of the neck, injects a normally taboo degree of sex, veiled as horror. In August 1821, having accrued overwhelming debt from gambling, John Polidori takes his own life with an overdose of prussic acid. It will not be the last the world has heard of John Polidori, nor his spirit. The vampire is introduced to Russia through Alexei Konstantinovich Tolstoy, with the 1841 publication of his novella Upir, or The Vampire. The vampire follows a young couple at a ball in Moscow, where it is revealed that the woman's family line has been cursed to become vampires. Tolstoy followed Upir with the family of the Vurdalak. In it, a French diplomat stays at the home of a Serbian peasant, Gorka, and his family. When Gorka returns home after slaying a vampire, he acts strangely. Gorka has become a Vurdalak, a vampire that preys on its family, and ultimately turns everyone from his children to his grandchildren to vampirism. James Malcolm Rymer, in 1847, expands on Polidori's vampire with Varney the Vampire, a serialized novel published in the British penny dreadful magazines of the time. Often sold for a mere cent and printed on cheap stock, the sensationalistic penny dreadfuls cater to the subliterate. Varney's success leads to a total of about 900 pages, all of which are later reprinted in novel format. Author James Malcolm Rymer was a Scottish writer who, prior to creating Varney, had worked as editor of the Queen's magazine. Shortly after penning an article looking down on popular fiction, such as The Dreadfuls, Queen's fails, and he earns the editorship of Lloyd's Penny Weekly Miscellany. Varney, the Vampire, builds off the Ruthven Vampire. Varney is also aristocratic and healed by the moonlight. However, where Ruthven is beautiful, Varney is quite grotesque.
The figure turns round. The light falls upon the face. It is perfectly white, perfectly bloodless. The eyes look like polished tin. The lips are drawn back. And the principal feature next to those dreadful eyes is the teeth. The fearful-looking teeth, projecting like those of some wild animal. hideously glaring white and fang-like. It approaches the bed with a strange, gliding movement. It clashes together the long nails that literally appear to hang from the fingers' ends.
Varney the Vampire, due to its prolonged publishing history, as well as the chance that writers other than Reimer had contributed, is rife with purple prose and inconsistencies.
Henry, have you ever heard of a strange and dreadful superstition which, in some countries, is extremely rife, by which it is supposed that there are beings who never die, said Marchdale, and must keep up such fearful existence upon human gore? Never die? Never, in a word, Henry. Have you ever heard of... I dread to pronounce the word. Speak it. It's a vampire. Good God. Even so, one who has to renew his dreadful existence by human blood. One who lives on forever. A vampire. Oh, good God. I could echo that groan, said Marchdale, but that I am so thoroughly bewildered, I know not what to think.
What Reimer does manage to do, perhaps in an effort to keep Varney interesting, is develop Varney from being an absolute monster to a somewhat sympathetic monster. Varney the Vampire flings himself to his own death in the mouth of Mount Vesuvius. Irish author Joseph Thomas Sheridan Le Fanu brings sexuality to the vampire and something more with the publication of his 1872 vampire story, Carmilla. Aside from skirting lesbianism between the protagonist and the titular female vampire, Carmilla is the first truly Gothic vampire story, taking place in a desolated castle and neighboring Gothic ruins. A young girl, Laura, and her father take in a young lady, Carmilla, as a house guest after she's injured in a stagecoach accident. The two quickly fall in love as Laura slowly finds her health declining amidst strange dreams of her new friend. Also present, much like in Varney, is the portrait of Carmilla, painted over a century ago when she was truly alive.
And so you were thinking of the night I came here? She almost whispered. Are you glad I came? Delighted, dear Carmilla, I answered. And you asked for the picture you think like me to hang in your room? She murmured with a sigh as she drew her arm closer about my waist and let her pretty head sink upon my shoulder. How romantic you are, Carmilla, I said. Whenever you tell me your story, it will be made up chiefly of some one great romance. She kissed me silently. I'm sure, Carmilla, you have been in love, that there is at this moment an affair of the heart going on. I have been in love with no one. I never shall, she whispered, unless it should be with you.
The sexual tension in Carmilla runs parallel to the psychological, as Laura continues to experience nightmares of her new friend.
One night, instead of the voice I was accustomed to hear in the dark, I heard one, sweet and tender, and at the same time terrible, which said, Your mother warns you to beware of the assassin. At the same time, a light unexpectedly sprang up, and I saw Carmilla standing near the foot of my bed in her white nightdress, bathed from her chin to her feet in one great stain of blood.
The vampire genre is really, it's amazed me how it has taken off. And of course it's recently been eclipsed by the zombie genre, but it's still really popular. And it's gone from vampires as being creatures that would, suck the lifeblood out of you, and evil, to being romantic figures. And being pretty and not monstrous. it's kind of hard for me to wrap my head around that, and seen it happen slowly over the years. But they're still popular. They're still just as popular as they were, but they've just changed the focus of why they're popular, I guess. But Dracula, the original Dracula, was always a film that Lugosi said it in many interviews that, it's a film you take a date to, because the girl will get scared and then want to hug you and get close to you, and then it seems to be that the vampire genre is more popular with women these days. And I guess Lugosi was right in a way back then. It's, more so, it seems there's a lot more female fans for the vampire genre than there are male fans. Of course, that, Anne Rice and all that, coming up with Lestat and those things, turning them into romantic figures, I guess had a lot to do with that.
When Anne Rice wrote Interview with the Vampire, she very much took the Gothic vampire, a la Dracula, and she ingeniously merged it with the mythology of ancient Egypt, the Osiris myth of the undead. She gave the vampire more of an underpinning and a foundation. She made them feel more legendary because of that. But beyond her origins of the vampiric race, what Anne Rice did was marry the erotic. She had been an erotic writer beforehand. Anne Rampling was her pen name. She married the erotic in ways that Bram Stoker never could do in the stilted Victorian times with Dracula. So we have these vampires they really are the first sexy vampires, but because they were vampires, they couldn't have sex, ergo they had no real gender. So she created this very ambivalent, bisexual vampire. It's almost as if she took what David Bowie was doing with his performances in the 1970s and brought it into the vampire mythos, combined with a bit of the old-fashioned romance novel.
Right now, I'm writing Vampirella for Dynamite Comics, who now own the copyright to the intellectual property rights to the character of Vampirella, who was originally created by Forrest J. Ackerman for Jim Warren's Warren Publications back in 1969. And the character is basically a female vampire, originally from outer space, but now not so much so, and who comes to Earth and becomes involved in fighting monsters and other vampires, and more or less for the good of mankind. And the original version the costume was designed by underground comics artist Trina Robbins, and the original character design of Vampirella was by famous artist Frank Frazetta, who did several of the original covers for the initial run of Vampirella back in 69-70. 2014 marks the 45th anniversary of Vampirella as her creation, and Dynamite's doing several things to celebrate that. And this year I started as the writer for the series. I'm the first woman in the 45-year history of the character to write Vampirella. We were doing, she kind of started off as a horror host almost, like the old Vampira, or as people nowadays might be more familiar with, Elvira. And she would introduce, it was a black and white magazine with kind of an anthology series. There'd be a couple of stories involving Vampirella, but mostly she would introduce the most awful puns imaginable. the other stories in the collection, and she ran the Vampirella series ran, I think, from 69 to 83, 84 maybe. I'm not that sure about when it ended, but it ran for a good long time. But it was always black and white. And after Warren Publications went into bankruptcy, Vampirella was up for grabs, so to speak, and she ended up first with Harris Comics, who turned her into a comic book character in the more traditional 4-color monthly comic pamphlet form. And when they went out of business, Dynamite, Dynamic Forces / Dynamite Comics stepped in and bought the character, and that's how I'm now ended up writing for them. Like I said, she was created by Forrest J. Ackerman, who was best known for most people for creating Famous Monsters of Filmland comics, which is also published by Warren Publications.
In 1854, the vampire craze does not escape America, particularly New England. In Jewett City, Connecticut, the Ray family suffers several deaths from 1845 to 1854. While it is likely tuberculosis, the family take it upon themselves to dig up the corpses of 2 of their brothers and burn them to end the supposed vampiric curse that had been haunting them. The Jewett City vampires are indicative of the vampire paranoia that sweeps New England, where vampirism becomes an easy explanation for diseases such as smallpox and tuberculosis. Most widespread of the American vampires is Mercy Lena Brown, whose case is indicative of modern science and medicine's impotence against mass hysteria and superstition. Tuberculosis visits the Brown family of Exeter, Rhode Island, in the late 1800s. First victim is Mrs. Mary Brown and her daughter Olive, leaving George Brown, his 4 daughters, and son Edwin. It takes 4 years for Edwin to first show signs of illness. While he seeks treatment elsewhere, his 19-year-old daughter Mercy dies. George Brown, skeptical of his neighbor's claim that it was vampirism, is left with no choice but to exhume the bodies of his wife, daughter, and granddaughter. If the corpses hold blood in the organs and the bodies are not decomposed, he must give in to their fear of vampirism. Where Olive and Mary's bodies are decomposed, Mercy's is considered less decomposed than it should be by the onlookers. The medical examiner on hand, Dr. Harold Metcalf, notes it is a normal amount for one dead a mere 9 weeks. When Metcalf is instructed to remove Mercy's heart and liver, and when blood drips from them, the townspeople are certain that she is a vampire. Ashes from the burning of the organs is mixed with medicine, and that Edwin drinks. The hope is to prevent the curse of the vampire from claiming him. He still dies shortly after. The Mercy Brown case has been inflated over the years. Visitors still claim, from time to time, to see a ball of light hovering over the grave, accompanied by the tiny voice of a girl.
Please, help me. Let me out.
Another example of mass hysteria? Perhaps, though it may likely be the one part of Mercy Brown lingering. Her soul, forced to haunt her grave from the defiling of her corpse. News of the Mercy Brown vampire case reaches beyond American shores, all the way to England. There, a theater manager, with a penchant for writing short stories, pores over the articles with interest. His name is Bram Stoker, and what he is about to write will redefine the vampire for the rest of its immortal life.